There was once a math teacher of a relatively small town. Although math is often a difficult subject for many young students, most found his class to be at least inoffensive. Even the kids who hated math at least did not hate the class itself. And of course they would feel that way because he was an excellent teacher. He always explained everything clearly and precisely. He always answered questions and would help students with difficult problems, sometimes even doing them together if there was a particularly difficult one. On tests, he gave partial credit if you started the problem correctly, or at least if you got part of it right. He even stayed after school to help students who were struggling with the material. Because of this, every student that at least gave an effort managed to get a reasonably good grade. However, there was one student, let's call him Billy, who had gotten into a bad habit. See, Billy was not one of those students who put in effort. He knew that the math teacher was great and that even the lazier students usually managed to pass. He thought that made the class easy. So he would sleep or daydream during class. He never did the homework, and he never went after school to study. But when the first test started to get closer, Billy realized he had no idea how to do anything that they had been learning. So the last week leading up to the test, he went in every single day to ask for help from the teacher. Finally, he took the test, and when he got the results back, he found he had actually done pretty well. And so, he did the exact same thing for the next test. He did nothing for weeks, and then the last week he would ask for help and cram in as much of the material into his head as he could. At first, it worked pretty well. He still could goof off in class, and he was still passing. Sure, the teacher had to stay much longer after school those few days before the test, but that was his job, right? But the thing about math is that each new chapter would often build on the stuff that they were learning in the previous chapters. And with Billy cramming for each test, he remembered less and less from the previous chapters. And he did worse and worse on those tests. Like a tall tower with too small of a foundation, it began to shake. He couldn't climb any higher. But still, Billy continued, believing it was enough to pass. At the end of the year, the final exam was approaching, and Billy was doing very poorly indeed. He realized that he would fail the class if he didn't do well, so he went in after school every day for 2 weeks to study. But it wasn't enough. He had missed too much. He had tried to relearn every chapter, but there just was not enough time. Sure enough, when he got the results back, he had failed. Billy went up to the teacher after class and pleaded. "You saw how hard I worked," he said. "Can't you at least give me a little credit for that?" The teacher just shook his head and sighed. "I did all that I could. Maybe don't wait until a crisis to come see me next time." For those of you who are just joining us, we've spent the last several weeks going through the book of Judges. Israel had conquered the land that God had promised to them and established themselves there. They were now an independent nation. But despite this, they had no formal hierarchy or leadership. They had the rules and practices that God had given them, but they proved to be pretty terrible at following them. They had gotten themselves trapped in a kind of a cycle. The people do evil in the eyes of the Lord. The Lord punishes them, or perhaps declines to prevent the invasion of Israel by other nations. Israel cries out to God after experiencing the oppression of that ruling nation. God would raise up a leader called a judge to rescue and lead them. And then once the judge dies, the people return to doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. But with each new cycle, the people got a little bit worse. They forgot the Lord quicker and more fully. They worshiped idols more fervently with more questionable practices. Their morals declined more sharply. And the judges that God raised up were not immune to this cycle either, becoming increasingly problematic. The earlier judges, Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, and Barak, were exceptional. But when we reach Gideon, there's a turning point. He was still mostly faithful to God, still exhibiting admirable qualities, but his story is also marred with bad choices and questionable motives. And while Gideon had done God's will and delivered Israel from its oppressors as he had been commanded, the more negative aspects of his time as a judge rubbed off on the next generation of Israelites. This is embodied best by his son Abimelech, who, with the full support of the Israelites, murdered 69 of his half-brothers so that he might declare himself the king. But once they had crowned him king, the people very quickly grew dissatisfied with his rule. They began raiding caravans and tried to assemble a rebellion. And Abimelech returned the favor by not only killing the rebels, but by massacring thousands, including the entire city of Shechem. He was only stopped when he was struck by a stone thrown by a woman whom he was trying to burn alive. In the end, both the Israelites and Abimelech brought about their mutual destruction. Quite a happy story, huh? A light one for this Sunday morning. It's one of the few stories from Judah's period where a judge isn't involved at all, hence the terribleness. No God-appointed leader was to be had. And notably, the Bible doesn't mention the Israelites trying to crown anyone again for quite a long time. So hopefully they learned their lesson from that little ordeal. Now, however, we come to the story of Jephthah. After Abimelech, there were few minor judges who cared for Israel. The Bible doesn't tell too much about them, but as you might have guessed, once they were gone, the Israelites again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And they worshiped all sorts of gods from the surrounding lands. They had turned away from the Lord, and in doing so, they invited oppression from those same nations. The Bible makes this abundantly clear. In Judges chapter 10, verse 6, it says, "They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines." And it was those last two peoples, the Ammonites and the Philistines, who invaded Israel. And those two peoples, the Ammonites and the Philistines, oppressed Israel brutally for 18 long years. Until finally, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, admitting that this was happening because they had turned their backs on the Lord and worshipped other gods. But the Lord told them that he had saved them numerous times before from various other nations who sought to oppress them, and yet they still turned their backs on him time and time again. They were essentially treating him like a last resort. They would ignore him when things were good and fine, but as soon as things got bad and they needed help, only then would they go back to God. God told them that they could go ask for help from the gods that they had chosen. But the people continued to cry out to God, even throwing out all of their idols and serving him to show their sincerity. God left them to deal with their consequences, but God is God. He loves us. Our joy is his joy, and our pain is his pain. And God soon found that he could stand their misery no longer. The Ammonites gathered in the land of Gilead, a small territory in Israel, to wage war against the Israelites. So the people of Gilead assembled at a camp nearby to prepare, but they needed a general to lead them. And so they searched from among themselves and found that there were none who were willing and able. None except an outcast. Years earlier, a young man named Jephthah was born in Gilead as a result of an affair between a man of wealth and respect and a prostitute woman. His half-brothers, looking down on his illegitimacy and not wanting to share their inheritance, drove Jephthah away. So Jephthah settled in a new land and became the leader of a group of adventurers, ruffians, and mercenaries, assembling a pretty formidable force. But now that the Ammonites were attacking, the people of Gilead needed such a leader. So they called upon Jephthah, promising that he could rule over their land if he led them in battle. The Gileadites did to Jephthah basically the same thing they did to God. They treated him poorly, they drove him out, and they ignored him. But when they found themselves in need, only then did they turn to Jephthah and treat him with respect. Like God, they treated Jephthah like a last resort. But still, Jephthah agreed to lead them, and he started out his campaign in a bit of a surprising way. He sent the Ammonites a messenger asking why they were attacking in hopes of finding a diplomatic solution, one with peace without war. After all, if the Ammonites knew that Israel now had a strong leader and military commander, it might make them reconsider this attack. And the Ammonites did respond. They replied saying that the Israelites had stolen their land and that they needed to give it back. Now, I won't go into excruciating detail on Jephthah's response, it's quite lengthy, but he basically recounted Israel's history, saying that 1, Israel took this land from different nations and never touched the lands of Ammon. God had given them this land. And 3, if they had taken it from Ammon, the Ammonites had made no attempts to reclaim it for 300 years. Ammon's claim on this land was surely false. But the Ammonites made no response. Whether the Ammonites actually believed that their land had been stolen was unimportant. They wanted the land, and they believed their military could take it. So they went to war. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah as they went into battle, but Jephthah did something kind of unexpected. He made a vow, saying, "If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." Why would Jephthah make a vow, and such a weird one at that? The Spirit of the Lord was already with him, so why did he feel the need to vow a sacrifice? It doesn't seem to make much sense. But you have to remember, Israel had not been faithful to God for some time. Sure, they had turned back to him and were attempting to genuinely be faithful now, but they had lost a lot of understanding in those periods of unfaithfulness. They knew that the Lord was their God, but they had forgotten what he was like, how he acted, and what he actually wanted. It got blended all together with the beliefs and practices of the other gods that they had worshipped. And in those days, when you wanted to curry favor with a deity, when you wanted to be blessed or ask from aid from a god, you made an offering or a sacrifice. If you wanted rain, you would make a sacrifice to a rain god. If you wanted a bountiful harvest, you would sacrifice to a god of the harvest or of vegetation or of land. If you wanted safe travel by boat, you would sacrifice to the god of that body of water or a god of the seas. It was viewed as a kind of an exchange, like lobbyists donating money to politicians. So Jephthah attempted to gain the favor of the Lord in the same way. It was well-meaning, but decades of the Israelites being away from the Lord had misled them. He didn't realize that the Lord had already favored him. But even if he were to make a vow, why make this one? Why sacrifice the first thing out of his door? That's simultaneously too vague and too specific. Like, what's the deal there? Some scholars argue that Jephthah thought it would be an animal that greeted him. Perhaps he kept animals inside his home or something, like when your dog or cat comes to greet you when you get home. But vowing to sacrifice an animal in exchange for a great military victory wasn't that significant. It's like going up to your spouse and saying, "I swear to you that if you buy me a brand new Ferrari, I will travel across the land to buy you your very own Chipotle burrito bowl." Like, you get Chipotle all the time. It's really not that big of a deal. Jephthah making a vow like this would probably have a greater significance. So let's go back to the religious practices of the surrounding nations. Those nations made animal, food, or material sacrifices to curry favor. But what about if you needed something really big? Or what if you were really, really desperate and wanted to make absolutely sure that your God accepted your sacrifice? Well, a human's life was much more valuable than an animal's, which is why people often thought that their gods would like a human sacrifice a lot more. When Jephthah returned home, he probably anticipated being greeted by a servant, and he would then sacrifice that servant to the Lord as thanks. It's pretty messed up. So Jephthah went to war, and because God was with him, he decimated the Ammonite army. It was a successful campaign capped off with an overwhelming victory. They were finally free from the Ammonites after 18 long years of oppression. It was time to celebrate, to rejoice. But when Jephthah returned home, the first thing he saw come out of his house was not an animal, nor was it a servant. It was his only child, the young daughter. Instead of celebrating as he should have been after such a great victory, Jephthah instead wept and told his daughter of the vow he had made. His daughter was heartbroken, but she didn't protest. She only asked for 2 months to mourn with her friends, and at the end of those 2 months, Jephthah sacrificed her for the Lord. When the people stray from God for too long, they make mistakes like this. Our God has never approved of human sacrifices. That was made clear long before the Judges period. Human life is a gift, and God's whole plan was about saving us so that we wouldn't lose that life to our sin. To destroy the life he gave and say that it was a gift for him didn't make much sense. But once again, being away from the Lord for so long had confused some things. And the practices of those other nations, the nations that practiced human sacrifice, blended with their faith in the Lord. Jephthah made a bad vow. He didn't want to sacrifice his daughter, and God didn't want him to sacrifice her either. He knew that breaking a vow was a sin, but he didn't recognize that human sacrifice was the greater sin. God would have preferred he break his vow and spare his daughter, but Jephthah didn't know what God wanted. He, along with the rest of the Israelites, had been away for too long. Like a boy who expected his teacher to rescue him from his poor decisions, the Israelites treated both God and Jephthah as a last resort. And as a result, they became more and more disconnected to God, and it led to their own misery. See, sometimes we treat God this same way. I once knew a girl who was not religious at all, never went to church or prayed or anything. She started going through a rough time, and through her talks with me, she started to talk more about God. She had found comfort in his love and faithfulness, maybe even prayed a little bit. But as soon as things were better, suddenly all of that disappeared. She never talked to me about it anymore or changed anything about her life. She only relied on God when she needed something. Or at a lot of bigger churches, for example, their attendance on Christmas and Easter services is much higher than at any of the other services of the year. Because there are some people who would only show up on the big holidays. Considering all of you are here this morning and probably have been here semi-frequently, I doubt any of you are quite that fickle. But even the best of us can find ourselves praying, going to church, and reading our Bibles less than we should when things are going according to plan. When things are going well, we don't have to rely on God for everything. And it's a lot easier to get sidetracked, to go chasing other things this way and that, to have God be more of an afterthought than a focus. But while it might seem obvious, the more time we spend away from God, the more distant from Him we become. And we end up inflicting misery upon ourselves. Think of it as the branches of a vine. In John 15, verses 5 through 8, Jesus says this, "I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Some branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples." Jesus is our vine. If we stay connected to him, we bear fruit. We become better people, and often we become happier because we inflict fewer poor decisions upon ourselves. But if we become disconnected, then we start to wither. And the longer we stay disconnected from Jesus, the more withered we become. And the thing about withering branches is that they often grow diseased or become infected. And it's much harder to grow back to full strength and begin producing fruit again. It's not impossible, but it's harder. So instead of acting as the Israelites, rushing to God only when we need something, only when things are bad, let us instead never lose sight of him. Let us never turn to the left or to the right. Let our branches stay forever connected to the vine. And let us forever pay attention in our math classes. Would you all pray with me this morning? Dear Lord, help us to keep our eyes on you. Help us to stay within the grasp of your arms. Help us to continue to walk with you through everything. When distractions arise around us, keep us focused. Keep our feet on the straight and narrow. Keep us walking along with you in your footsteps. And keep us connected to your vine. Help us to grow fruit and to grow fruitful, to be better and better people, to make good decisions and to follow in your ways. Lord, keep us focused and help us to remember who you truly are. We pray this in your name, Jesus.